The teller's voice was very calm when she said, "I'm sorry, Ms. Whitmore, but this account shows a zero balance as of March 4th. My name is Paige, I'm 32, and I want to tell you that for a full 5 seconds after she said that, I genuinely believed I was looking at someone else's account. I'm a data analyst at a company called Datasphere, which means I spend my days finding the exact moment where a pattern breaks, the single row in a spreadsheet that doesn't match the 10,000 rows around it. I'm good at my job because I don't trust a number until I've traced where it came from. That instinct, that refusal to accept a figure at face value, is the only reason this story ends the way it does, and I didn't know yet, standing at that teller's counter on a gray Tuesday afternoon, that I was about to need it more than I ever had in my life. I'd walked into that branch to check on an account I'd been building, quietly and deliberately, for 8 years. Not a checking account. Not something I touch day to day. A savings account my father, Gerald, had been added to as co-owner when I was 17, a decision my parents had made together, back when it seemed like a reasonable safety net for a teenager who'd just gotten her first job at a pharmacy counter. Back before I understood what it would eventually cost me to leave that arrangement in place for 15 more years out of nothing but habit and trust. I had $140,312.67 in that account 4 months earlier. I know the number exactly because I'd checked it exactly 4 months earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with a mortgage pre-approval letter open beside my laptop, doing the math on a down payment for a house I'd been dreaming about since I was 24. That can't be right, I told the teller. Her name tag said Teresa. I had over $140,000 in that account in November. Teresa's fingers moved over her keyboard, her expression shifting from polite to something more careful. There was a transfer, she said slowly, turning her monitor slightly so I could see. March 4th. Full balance, transferred to an external account ending in 4471. I stared at the screen. My own electronic signature sat beside the authorization line, the little scrawled approval I use for online transfers, the one I'd typed maybe 100 times over the years for smaller, routine things. I hadn't authorized anything in March. I hadn't authorized anything since the previous fall. I need to see the full transaction record, I said, and I noticed, distantly, that my voice had gone very flat and very even. The way it does at work when a report comes back wrong, and I need to find out exactly where the error started before I let myself react to it. Teresa printed the page. I stood at that counter reading it 3 times, the way you reread a sentence that doesn't change no matter how many times you look at it, and somewhere underneath the disbelief, a colder, quieter part of me was already doing the thing I do best, tracing the pattern backward, looking for the moment it had started. I want to tell you something about my family before I go further, because none of what happened at that bank counter makes sense without it. My father and I had always had what I would have described, up until that Tuesday, as a close relationship, closer, in some ways, than the one I had with my mother, Susan, who'd always seemed to orbit more naturally around my younger brother, Tyler. My father used to call me his steady one. I used to hear that phrase and feel something warm settle in my chest, the particular warmth of being told you're trusted, you're reliable, you're the daughter who doesn't cause problems. I didn't understand yet, standing in that bank, how much that warmth had cost me, or how long it had been quietly funding someone else's life. Ms. Whitmore. Teresa's voice pulled me back. Would you like to speak with our fraud department? Sometimes unauthorized transfers can be. It wasn't unauthorized, I heard myself say, and the words tasted strange in my mouth even as I said them, because some part of me, some old, practiced, deeply worn part of me, had already started building the explanation before I'd even confirmed there needed to be one. My father's a co-owner on the account. He probably just moved things around for tax reasons. I'll call him. I said that out loud, in a bank lobby, to a stranger, before I'd said it to myself even once with any real conviction. That's the thing I need you to understand about who I was that afternoon, 32 years old, financially literate enough to build 6 figures in savings over 8 years of disciplined denial and budgeting, and still, underneath all of it, a woman whose first instinct upon discovering her life savings had vanished was to protect the person most likely responsible for it. I called my father from the parking lot. He answered on the second ring, his voice easy, unbothered, the voice of a man mid-errand. Hey, Paige Y. What's up? Dad, did you move money out of the savings account? The one we're both on. There was a pause, not long, maybe a second and a half, but I would replay that specific pause more times over the following months than I could count, because in hindsight, it was the first crack in everything. Oh, he said. Yeah, I did. Your brother needed some help with the new place. I meant to call you about it. I sat in my car with the phone against my ear, engine off, and felt something in my chest go very still, the particular stillness that arrives right before you understand you're about to hear a number you're not prepared for. How much, Dad? It's fine, honey, we'll sort it out. Family helps family. How much? Another pause. All of it. But Paige, listen. I don't remember much of what he said after that. I remember sitting in that parking lot for 11 minutes with the phone still warm against my ear long after he'd hung up, staring at a stucco wall, doing math I didn't want to do. 8 years. Every extra shift, every bonus I hadn't spent, every year I'd told myself just a little longer, and I'll have enough for a down payment. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call in the parking lot wasn't the worst conversation I'd have with my father. It wasn't even close. The worst one was still 4 months away, and it would happen in front of 45 people holding champagne glasses. I have to take you back to the fall before all this, because the theft didn't begin in March. It began months earlier, in small, deniable pieces I chose, again and again, not to add up. That October, my father turned 60, and we threw him a party at my parents' house, string lights in the backyard, a rented folding dance floor, 40 or so relatives and family friends eating off paper plates. I remember it as a good night, mostly, the kind of gathering that still made me believe, at least in the moment, that whatever quiet unevenness existed in how my parents treated Tyler and me, the underlying warmth was real. I'm a data analyst, and I want to tell you something about what that job does to a person over time. It trains you to notice when the story someone's telling doesn't match the numbers behind it. I didn't consciously apply that instinct to my own family that October. I wish I had. But there was a moment, late in the party, when I walked into the kitchen for more ice and found my father and Tyler standing close together near the sink, voices low, stopping mid-sentence the second they registered I was in the room. Everything okay? I asked. Fine, my father said, too quickly, reaching for a dish towel he didn't need. Just talking business stuff. Boring stuff. Tyler wouldn't quite meet my eyes. He'd always been like that when he was uncomfortable, a habit from childhood I recognized instantly and, that night, dismissed instantly too, filing it under nothing, the same drawer I'd been filing small unexplained things about my family into for years. My Aunt Robin, my father's older sister, caught me in the hallway on my way back outside. She'd had 2 glasses of wine and the specific loosened caution that comes with it. You keeping an eye on your accounts, sweetheart? She asked, out of nowhere, her tone light but her eyes not quite matching it. What do you mean? Nothing, just, your father's been under some pressure lately. Money pressure. I just worry is all. He's always had a soft spot for bailing your brother out. I laughed it off. Dad's fine, Aunt Robin. He's got his retirement, the house is paid off. I think he's just stressed about turning 60. I said that with real confidence. The confidence of someone who genuinely believed she understood the shape of her own family's finances, and I want to be honest with you about why I believed it so completely. Because believing otherwise would have meant admitting that the account I'd been building for 8 years, the one with my father's name still on it, 15 years after it stopped needing to be there, was sitting exposed, unprotected, in a way I had every reasonable opportunity to fix. And never did. That's the mistake I have to own here. Not naivety, exactly. Something closer to willful convenience. Taking my father off that account would have meant a conversation, an uncomfortable one, an implication that I didn't trust him, that our relationship needed a boundary it had apparently never needed before. I avoided that conversation for years because avoiding it was easier than having it, and I told myself that was love, when really, some part of me suspects now, it was just fear dressed up as loyalty. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever kept a boundary soft because enforcing it felt like an accusation you weren't ready to make, You know exactly what that hallway conversation with my aunt felt like. Not alarm, not yet. Just a small, cold draft under a door you'd always assumed was sealed. The weeks after the party settled back into normal, I went to work, ran my quarterly reports, met Owen. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me stay in the fall. My father called more often that November than he usually did, small, unremarkable calls, checking in, asking about work, asking, twice, in a way that seemed casual at the time, whether I'd thought any more about maybe consolidating some of your accounts, just simplifying things. I said I'd think about it. I didn't think about it. I had a mortgage pre-approval letter to plan around and a life that felt, from the inside, entirely ordinary. Tyler, meanwhile, had just signed a lease on a new luxury apartment downtown, nicer than anything I'd ever rented, in a building with a doorman and a gym I'd seen advertised online with rent figures that made me do a small, private double-take. I remember thinking, briefly, distantly, how is he affording that, and then letting the thought go, the way you let go of 100 small observations a day that don't fit neatly into anything yet. It was around this time that a colleague of mine, Priya, who worked 2 desks over in data forensics, mentioned over lunch that she'd just finished a project tracing fraudulent internal transfers for a client, routine metadata analysis, timestamps, IP addresses, the digital fingerprints a transaction leaves behind whether or not anyone means for it to. I remember listening to her describe the work with professional interest and nothing more. No sense yet that I'd be calling her, for months later, about my own family. By the time my father's birthday season had passed and December arrived, the signs had stopped feeling like isolated dust motes and started feeling, very faintly, very deniably, like something with a shape I didn't want to look at directly. I didn't look at it directly. Not yet. I want to be honest about that. I had the emails. I had the transaction alerts sitting unread in a folder I rarely checked, because I'd set up those accounts years earlier and simply trusted them to run quietly in the background of my life, the way you trust a smoke detector's battery without checking it. I didn't know it yet, but one of those unread alerts, buried 3 weeks deep in a folder I hadn't opened since September, contained a timestamp that would end up mattering more than anything else I'd find that year. By January, the small unease from the fall had curdled into something I couldn't quite name, but couldn't stop circling either. I'd started, without fully admitting to myself why, checking my accounts more frequently than I used to, not obsessively, just more than the once-a-month glance I'd maintained for years. I told myself it was because of the house search, because I wanted to track my down payment progress. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth. In late January, I got a call from my mother, which was unusual enough on its own to catch my attention. "Just checking in," she said, in a tone I recognized immediately as the tone she used when she was checking in on something specific and didn't want to name it directly. "How's the house hunting going? You still saving up?" "Yeah, going well," I said. "I think I'm getting close to where I need to be." There was a pause on her end, not long, but noticeable, the kind of pause I'd later learned to recognize as a very specific tell in my family, the sound of someone deciding in real time how much truth a sentence could safely carry. "That's great, honey," she said finally. "Real estate's so competitive right now." I hung up feeling unsettled without being able to say exactly why. I called my best friend, Robin. No, I already have an Aunt Robin, let me not confuse that. I called Hannah, my closest friend since college, and mentioned the strange call. "That's weird," Hannah said. "Ask your mom directly what she's fishing for." I didn't. I told myself, again, that I was reading too much into things, that stress about the house search was making me paranoid about people who loved me. That's a phrase I used a lot that winter, reading too much into things, and I've come to understand since that it was less an observation and more a defense mechanism, a way of protecting a version of my family I wasn't ready to lose. The accidental catalyst came on an ordinary Thursday evening in February, and it didn't arrive dramatically. I was doing exactly what I do every day at work, reconciling a client's transaction logs against their internal reporting, looking for discrepancies, and something about the rhythm of that task nudged me, almost involuntarily, toward my own neglected accounts. I opened the alert folder I hadn't touched since September, Mostly out of habit, mostly because my job had trained a part of my brain to feel uneasy about unopened financial data sitting anywhere unchecked. There, buried in a string of routine notifications, was a transfer alert from the previous November, 4 months earlier, for $25,000, moved from my savings account into an account I didn't recognize. Dated the same week as my father's birthday party. I sat very still at my kitchen table, the blue light of my laptop the only light in the room, and read that alert 4 times. I want to be honest about what I did next, because it wasn't brave, not yet. I didn't call my father. I didn't call the bank. I opened a spreadsheet because that's what I do, that's the shape my mind takes under pressure, and I started building a timeline. Every loan I could remember giving Tyler or my parents over the years, every casual Venmo request, just this once, going back as far as my records allowed. The number that emerged, over 2 hours of quiet, methodical work, was $87,400. Money I'd given over nearly a decade, framed always as help, never once as a loan with terms, because asking for terms would have meant treating my own family like a transaction, and some part of me had always believed that doing so would make me the cold one. The difficult one, the daughter who didn't understand family. I stared at that number, $87,400, and felt something in my chest tighten in a way I recognized from nowhere pleasant. I called Priya the next morning, keeping my voice as casual as I could manage. Hypothetically, I said, if someone wanted to trace exactly where an unauthorized transfer originated, IP address, device, timestamp, is that something you could actually pull, or is that TV nonsense? It's real, she said. Banks keep metadata on every transaction. Why, what's going on? I told her. I remember her going quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before she said, Paige, that's not a family misunderstanding. That's fraud. I didn't respond to that right away. Some old, stubborn part of me still wanted it to be a misunderstanding, still wanted there to be a version of the next conversation with my father that ended in an apology and a repayment plan rather than something with a name like fraud attached to it. That same week, I finally told my mother, carefully, that I'd found the November transfer, the one that predated the March one by 4 months. I watched over the phone, in the specific way you watch someone through the texture of their voice, her reaction shift through something that felt less like surprise and more like management. I'm sure your father can explain that, she said. You know how he gets when Tyler's struggling. He just wants to help. He forged my signature, Mom. On both transfers. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. I don't think that's what happened, she said finally, her voice gone careful, controlled. I think you're upset, and I understand that, but let's not use words like that before we know the full story. I hung up that call with the clarity I hadn't had going into it. My mother already knew. Not the specifics, maybe, but enough. Enough to have a defense ready before I'd even finished describing the crime. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call with my mother wasn't the last time someone in my family would ask me to soften a word before I'd even finished saying it. I hired Owen the following week, a lawyer friend of a friend who specialized in financial fraud, a calm, unhurried man in his 40s who listened to my entire timeline without interrupting once and then said, simply, you need forensics before you need a lawyer. Get the metadata first. I brought everything to Priya properly this time, not hypothetically. She pulled the transaction logs for both transfers, the November $25,000 and the March $115,312.67 that had emptied the account completely, and within 4 days. She had something I wasn't prepared for. Both transfers originated from the same IP address, she told me, sliding a printed report across her kitchen table one evening after work. Residential connection, registered to a Gerald Whitmore. Timestamp on the March transfer, 3:47 a.m. I stared at that timestamp for a long time. 3:47 in the morning. My father, a man who went to bed at 9:30 every night of his life that I could remember, sitting awake at nearly 4 a.m., moving my entire savings account into an account ending in 4471. There's something else, Priya said, more gently. The digital signature used to authorize both transfers. It's not a hack, not a stolen password. It's a manually recreated approval, built from templates of your past authorizations. Someone studied how you sign off on transfers and reconstructed it by hand. I sat with that information the way you sit with an X-ray showing something you already suspected but hoped wouldn't be confirmed. My father hadn't just taken the money. He'd studied me first. He'd learned the shape of my signature specifically so that I wouldn't notice. I want to tell you about the moment I almost confronted him with all of this too early, because it's the choice that shaped everything that came after. I drove to my parents' house that same night, Priya's report sitting in a folder on my passenger seat, fully intending to walk in and lay it on the kitchen table. I got as far as the driveway. I sat there with the engine off for nearly 20 minutes. And then I didn't go in. I understood, sitting there, that walking in now, with proof but no plan, no legal footing, no witnesses beyond my own family, who had already shown me exactly how quickly they'd close ranks around a familiar story, would only give my father time to build a defense before anyone official was in a position to hear the truth first. So I put the folder away and I called Owen instead. "Don't confront him yet," Owen said. "Let's get a formal police report filed and a fraud investigator involved before anyone in your family knows how much you actually have." That decision cost me something over the following weeks that I hadn't anticipated. At a family dinner not long after, my mother mentioned, almost lightly, that she'd heard I'd been asking a lot of questions about the account. "Have you been talking to lawyers about your father, Paige?" she asked, in front of Tyler, in a tone that made it sound less like a reasonable question and more like a betrayal in progress. I felt the truth rise in my throat and swallowed it. "I'm just trying to understand what happened with the account," I said. "That's all." I watched Tyler's shoulders ease slightly at that, the specific relief of someone who'd been braced for something worse. I let him have that relief. It cost me something to do it, a small, real piece of my own dignity, letting them believe, a little longer, that I didn't already have a forensic report with his new apartment's rent numbers quietly cross-referenced against the timeline of transfers. It was during this stretch that I learned two things that reframed everything I thought I understood about my family. The first came from my Uncle Gary, my father's younger brother, over coffee one weekend when I'd driven out under the guise of a casual visit, but really to feel out how much the wider family already suspected. Gary, normally reserved, said something that stopped me cold. "You know your father did something like this once before, years ago, with your grandmother's accounts, before she passed. Nothing ever came of it. Your grandmother forgave him and never told anyone outside the family." I had never heard this story. Not once in 32 years. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Gary looked uncomfortable. "Because it worked out, I guess. Because we all just moved past it. That's what your father's family does, Paige. We move past things." I drove home that night turning that fact over and over. This wasn't a single desperate act born of a bad year. This was a pattern with a history, one that predated me, one that had already been quietly forgiven once before under circumstances no one had thought to warn me about. The second thing I learned came from Tyler himself, though he didn't mean to tell me. I'd stopped by his new apartment to drop off a housewarming gift ahead of the party he was planning, and I found him on his balcony, phone to his ear, unaware I'd let myself in. I heard just enough before he noticed me. I told him it wasn't fair to her, I did say that, but he said family helps family, and, honestly, I needed it. I'm not the bad guy here. He hung up fast when he saw me, his smile arriving a half-second too late. "Hey, didn't hear you come in. Who is that?" I asked. "Just a friend," he said. "Nothing important." I didn't believe him, and something in my face must have shown it, because for just a moment, I saw a flicker of something that looked almost like fear cross his face. Not of me exactly. Of what I might already know. By the time Owen confirmed that Detective Alina Cruz would be handling the case formally, and that an arrest, if it came, would likely need to happen wherever my father could be reliably located with the least resistance, I understood, with a cold clarity, that the housewarming party Tyler was planning in 3 weeks, the one my parents had already RSVP'd to, the one where my father would be surrounded by exactly the kind of audience he'd always cared most about impressing, was very likely going to be that place. I didn't know it yet, but the report sitting in my bag wasn't the only thing waiting to surface at that party. There was a second truth about to come out too, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who in my family had known the whole time. The morning of Tyler's housewarming, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm, my heart already moving faster than it should have for someone still lying in bed. I hadn't slept well in weeks. My appetite had thinned to almost nothing. I'd stood in front of my open refrigerator most nights that month and closed it again without eating. I called Owen at 7. Detective Cruz confirmed she'll be there, he said. Plainclothes, low profile, until it's time. You don't have to do or say anything, Paige. The report speaks for itself. I arrived at Tyler's building that evening, 45 guests eventually filling his new apartment and rooftop terrace, colleagues, family friends, relatives I hadn't seen since my father's 60th. My parents arrived together, my father in a blazer I recognized from every holiday photo of the last decade, easy and warm, working the room the way he always did. For the first hour, I said almost nothing. I let the party happen around me, let my father make his toast to Tyler's new place, let my mother compliment the view from the terrace to anyone who'd listen. Detective Cruz was already there, near the kitchen, a glass of sparkling water in hand, indistinguishable from any other guest. Then my father found me near the drink table, glass in hand, smiling. "There's my steady one," he said, the old phrase landing very differently than it once had. "Everything okay? You've seemed distant lately." "I found the November transfer, Dad," I said quietly. "The 25,000. Before the March one." His smile didn't waver, not immediately. "We talked about this. I was going to pay it back. You forged my signature. On both. I have the forensic report." That was my moment, and I took it, not loudly, not with a scene, just steady. I reached into my bag and held up the folder, not opening it, just letting him see the label on the front. Whitmore, Transaction Analysis. His face did something I'll remember for the rest of my life. A flicker of pure, cornered recognition, gone almost as fast as it arrived, replaced by the easy defensiveness I'd watched him use my whole life to smooth over smaller problems. "Paige, sweetheart, this isn't the place." "It's exactly the place," I said, my voice carrying further than I'd intended. Nearby conversations began to quiet. "Because you emptied an account with $140,312 in it. 8 years of my savings. And you did it at 3:47 in the morning, using a signature you spent time learning how to fake." The room had gone still in the way a room goes still when it senses something real is happening underneath the party. My mother appeared at my father's side. "Paige, please, not here, not in front of everyone." "You knew," I said, turning to her. "You knew about the November transfer before I told you. I heard it in your voice." She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. My father's reaction moved through its stages almost exactly as I might have predicted. Denial first. "This is a family matter, Paige. We don't need lawyers involved in a family matter." Then justification, sharper, aimed less at the fraud than at my unwillingness to simply absorb it. "Your brother needed that money more than you did. You had a good job, no kids, no real expenses. I did what any father would do." "Family helps family," I said. I've heard that phrase for 8 years. I didn't realize it only ever meant me. Tyler, standing near the terrace doors, had gone pale, his champagne glass forgotten in his hand. When he finally spoke, it wasn't in his father's defense. "I knew," he said, quiet enough that people had to lean in slightly. "I knew where the money for this place came from. I told myself it was fine because Dad said it was handled. I've been telling myself that for months." My Aunt Robin, who I hadn't even noticed had arrived, made a small, sharp sound near the back of the room. Her expression, watching my father, told me everything. She'd suspected this pattern might repeat itself, and she was only now understanding how far it had actually gone. It was at this point that Detective Cruz stepped forward, quiet and precise, her badge appearing from her jacket pocket. "Gerald Whitmore, I need you to step aside with me, please." The room's stillness cracked into something closer to chaos, gasps, murmured questions, someone's champagne glass set down too hard on the terrace railing. My father's face moved through a final, fast sequence, confusion, then something rawer underneath it, something that looked, for the first time in my life, like genuine fear. "This is insane," he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Paige, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them." I didn't tell them that. I stood very still. My son, no, I don't have a son in this version. Let me correct that internally. I stood very still, holding the folder, and said nothing at all, because for the first time in 32 years, I understood that my silence didn't need to protect him anymore. Detective Cruz read him his rights quietly, efficiently, professionally, while 45 guests watched a party dissolve into something none of them would forget. My mother reached for my father's arm as the handcuffs went on, her face crumpling into something between grief and fury, though I couldn't tell, even then, which one was aimed at him and which was aimed at me. "I need you to understand something," my father said to me, just before Detective Cruz led him toward the door, his voice smaller now than I'd ever heard it. "I never meant for it to become this. I believe that. It didn't change anything." My father was formally charged with fraud and forgery 2 weeks after that party. He pleaded guilty rather than risk a trial, and the court ordered full restitution, $140,312.67, plus interest, alongside probation and community service. It wasn't a long sentence. It was, for the first time in his life, a consequence he couldn't reframe as misunderstood generosity. He lost more than the money, though the money mattered, of course it mattered. He lost, in the weeks that followed, the specific image he'd spent 60 years building among friends and extended family, the reliable patriarch, the man who always helped. Word moved fast after the party. People who'd known him for decades stopped calling. My Uncle Gary, who'd once told me the family simply moved past things, cut contact with him entirely, unable to reconcile a second offense with the private forgiveness he'd extended for the first. Tyler lost the apartment within 4 months, sold at a loss once the reality of paying his own way set in, and lost, too, something less tangible, my trust, which I don't know if he'll ever fully rebuild. We speak occasionally now, careful, tentative conversations that neither of us has decided yet are worth the difficulty of continuing. My mother sent me a letter 2 months after the arrest, 3 paragraphs that apologized for my distress, without once using the word forgery, without once acknowledging that she'd known. I read it twice and did not respond. Some apologies aren't actually apologies. I'd spent 32 years mistaking the shape of one for the substance of one, and I wasn't willing to make that mistake again. I think often about that November transaction alert, sitting unread for 3 months in a folder I'd stopped checking out of nothing more than habit. I understand now that waiting cost me something, 3 extra months of exposure, 3 months my father used to plan a second, larger theft. But I also understand that if I'd confronted him the moment I found that first alert, with no forensic report, no lawyer, no plan, he would have talked his way around it the same way he'd talked his way around everything for 60 years. Waiting, gathering proof, choosing the moment and the witnesses, that was never coldness. That was the only way the truth was ever going to hold. I bought my house 4 months later, with the restored funds and a modest loan to cover what interest hadn't yet been repaid. I stood in the empty living room the day I got the keys and felt something I hadn't expected, not triumph exactly. Something quieter. Something closer to relief. I think about the phrase, family helps family, more than I'd like to. I understand now that it was never really a value in my house. It was a rule that only ever ran in one direction, and I spent 8 years too grateful for the occasional warmth of being called steady to notice which way the money had always flowed. If you've ever been the responsible one in a family that quietly depended on your responsibility more than they ever respected it, I think you already understand most of what I've just told you. I don't know what my relationship with my parents looks like in 5 years. I know it will not look like it did before that housewarming, and I've made a strange kind of peace with that. I am not the same woman who sat in that bank parking lot 4 months earlier, already building her father's excuse before he'd even given her one. I am someone who checks her own accounts now. I am someone with a house that has only ever had my name on the deed. If someone in your life has ever used the word family as a reason you should stay quiet, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. 1 word is enough. And thank you, genuinely, for sitting with my story the way I once wished someone had warned me about mine. What's most striking about Gerald isn't that he stole from his daughter, it's that he never seemed to experience it as stealing at all. He built, over decades, an internal accounting system where Paige's success was continually treated as a kind of surplus, something she could afford to have taken from her precisely because she'd never made enough noise about it before. Look at the shape of the pattern across generations before assuming this began with the November transfer. Gary's offhand mention of what happened with Paige's grandmother's accounts reveals something crucial. This wasn't Gerald's first offense, it was his first offense with consequences. A family that quietly absorbed the first theft, that treated forgiveness as identical to accountability, effectively taught him that the behavior worked, that the people closest to him would rather maintain the peace than name what he'd done. Paige inherited that lesson without ever being told it existed. The real turning point of this story isn't the party, it's the driveway. Sitting there with the forensic report already in hand, choosing not to walk inside and confront her father immediately, is the decision that actually determined how this ended. Confronting him privately, without legal footing, would have handed him the exact tool he'd used his whole life, the ability to talk his way around an accusation before anyone official was positioned to hear the truth first. Her patience wasn't hesitation. It was the same instinct that makes her good at her job, understanding that timing changes what evidence means. There's also something worth sitting with in Susan's specific failure, separate from Gerald's calculated theft. She wasn't the one who forged a signature, but her instinct to manage the story rather than confront it, to soften fraud into a family misunderstanding before she'd even heard the full account, was its own quiet complicity. Tyler's later admission, that he told himself the money was handled because it was easier than asking where it came from, names something a lot of people recognize. Convenient ignorance rarely feels like a choice while you're making it. It only looks like one afterward. What lingers longest isn't the $140,000, and it was never really about the number. It's the particular loneliness of discovering that the phrase used to describe you with affection, steady, responsible, the one we can count on, had quietly become the justification for what was taken from you. Which raises a harder question worth sitting with. How many of us have mistaken being trusted for being valued, until the difference became impossible to ignore?